Hello there. This is RJ. Welcome to the IWS podcast. I have a very special guest today, Miss Shelby Barlow. Shelby, how are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. We had quite the discussion, our first discussion offline, and it left a lot for me to make sure that we got to portray for the audience. So I'm glad to jump in and really get to explore more about your background, your experiences, and ultimately why you're here. So I want to start by really discussing more about your upbringing so the audience understands a lot about what I know, where you grew up, where you came from, who was in your home, all those family dynamics in that environment that you grew up in. So what do you feel comfortable sharing with us today?
Yeah, sure. So I was born and raised in Long Beach, Mississippi, a small town on the coast, about an hour east of New Orleans. I grew up with my mom, dad, and my little sister. My parents were together until I was in eighth grade. They separated the summer right before I went to high school. And once they separated, my dad moved out. I spent weekends with my dad, usually every weekend, sometimes every other weekend, just depending on what was going on in
Mm,
my family at the time. Um, so yeah, like I said, grew up with my sister. Started spending weekends with my dad when I was a high schooler,
yeah.
and then once I graduated high school, I moved to Philadelphia for college. So I moved away from home at that point. So that's like an overview of what I grew.
Okay. Quick question. Why so far away? Because Philadelphia, Mississippi, it's quite a big gap.
Yeah, just the school I went to. I went to the University of Pennsylvania. It's a really good school, and I got a really good scholarship. So, and I
Okay.
wanted to live in a city because I'd always grown up in a small town. So I was curious about the city lifestyle.
Okay. How do you think that compared for you? Like you said, growing up in that smaller community versus being in a much larger city.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, Philly is not. Even though it's a big city, it does kind of have a comfortable, like cozy feel, or at least I felt that way. And also
Yeah.
being on campus and just around other college kids, I didn't, So I was in the city, but I wasn't like in the city.
It's
You
like
know what
it's not like I was in New York.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I hate New York in terms of I could never live there. It's just way too overwhelming. I definitely like it a little bit of a slower pace. So Philly was perfect for me in that way, and that it was a big city, so I got to dip my toes in, but it wasn't overwhelming. It was
Okay.
amazing. I loved it. My freshman year, I was just in awe at the downtown area and actually seeing like real taxis driving around. You don't see that in Mississippi, so
Now, hold on. I think this is important to acknowledge because you said I don't want to live in a big city, even though Pennsylvania or that area wasn't as busy as maybe New York. Just so the audience knows, where do you reside currently?
I live in Miami Beach specifically. I'm on the little island over here, ducked off. So it's a
Okay.
little. I would say Miami Beach also has that small town feel
Really?
that I like. Yeah, I think
Hmm.
that's why I don't live in Brickell, for example, because I feel like it's the New York of Miami, and I don't want to live there. Whereas on the beach, I know my neighbors. I run into people who live in the same area. It's a lot
Yeah.
like being in a small town.
Okay. No, I thought that was ironic because I wanted to make sure that that everybody else
I
understood
hear
that.
you.
No, and I will say when I was down there, I was in Brickell, so I can definitely get what you mean. To me, it gave me Chicago vibes actually. Just with the way that people were walking around and the way that the high rises are set up in the restaurants, it has that downtown city feel. So I get
Yeah.
what you mean. Very busy people on the
Yeah,
go.
really busy there. Lots of traffic.
Yes, no, absolutely. So going a little bit deeper into talking about like your family dynamic with who you grew up with, how would you describe your relationship with your mom and your dad? Maybe it might be beneficial to talk a little bit about how it was like when everybody was together and then how it was like after your dad moved out and you visit him more on the weekends.
Totally. So I would have always been really close to both of my parents. I grew up really attached to both of them
Mm,
and definitely experiencing a lot of love and togetherness. We did a lot together as a family, like going to church together on Sundays and then going bowling after or eating together. We would like swim in the pool together. We'd take bike rides.
yeah.
So I had a lot of that, just classic family experiences that I'm really grateful for. I will say I had a much better relationship with my dad growing up than I did with my mom. My mom was definitely more authoritarian and just a little bit. not the most stable person emotionally. And so, especially once I became a teenager, she and I
Yeah.
had a lot of difficulty. And then, meanwhile, during that time, my dad was really my rock. I mean, my whole life from childhood to, up until becoming an adult, my dad was always my biggest fan, my
Yeah.
number one supporter, super just emotionally involved and close with both me and my sister. And honestly did more of the child rearing, at least emotionally, than my mom even did. For example,
Mm.
he would take my sister and I shopping for the new school year, and he did our hair and things of that nature.
Shout
So
out to dad.
yeah, yeah, and I mean, he also had to because my mom, she's way out of her depth. Like, white lady had no idea what to do with this.
No, but to your point though, real quick, that's not a very common experience. I think that we hear as much about is dads taking on some of those more domestic duties,
Mhm.
like still being a dad, but those are things that a lot of times I would imagine we see moms doing, and that's more widely accepted. So it's awesome to hear that your father was doing those type of things for you.
Yeah, totally. And even beyond that, he did most of the cooking in our house. He did a lot of the cleaning. I mean, like I described my mom earlier, she's a, great heart, lovely person, a little bit unstable. So as a
Mm,
result, my dad was often just kind of the parent of the household. But I will say my mom, she managed more. She was more of the financial manager. Like she controlled more of the finances and decided how our family money was spent and things of that nature. She did most
yeah.
of the yard work. So it's interesting because I feel like
Mm,
I grew up watching my parents just not fit gender roles at all. They kind of just did
yeah.
what they preferred and what they were best at. Like my dad, he's not a details guy, is not really into numbers or things of that nature, like didn't really care to keep up with that stuff. So I feel like I just grew up in a household where each one of them did what they wanted to do
Yeah.
and it worked really well for my family because I personally I didn't grow up with any specific ideas about how I was supposed to act as a woman or how a man was supposed to act as a man. I just kind of watched my parents figure it out on their own terms, and it worked really well for our household.
Wow. Okay. Now I think that's very interesting to really reflect on and understand, because just thinking about what you said, that each side didn't really follow what we would consider typical roles for their particular gender, right? So you're saying mom was being more of the financial, maybe planner, advisor, guide, and usually those are things that we see men traditionally do. She's cutting grass. That's definitely traditionally a man task. Not that there's anything wrong with a woman cutting grass, but again, typical. And then again, you were talking about your dad doing you guys' hair, which I think is also very interesting. I do want to make sure we clarify here what's the background of both mom and dad, just so the audience understands what we were talking about.
Yeah, so my mom is white. Her family is French Cajun specifically. So they're white people, but they got, kind of tan skin, curly hair. Sometimes people think my mom is biracial,
Mm,
interesting enough, but yeah, French Cajun. And then my dad is black, specifically with Nigerian ancestry.
okay,
And both of my parents and their families are from the Mississippi Gulf Coast. My
got you.
family, their
Okay,
families, my families have been there for generations.
awesome. Okay, and I just want to clarify that because I think, and I imagine we're going to get into in a little while talking a bit of it about cultural identity and what it's like when you come from backgrounds where it's a bit more mixed up, it's
Yeah.
very very visually mixed up, and how that might play on the way that we see ourselves and how we deal with other people. But back to mom and dad. So you said you didn't really have any specific expectations because you just sort of observed, like many of us do, what our parents do. And then we start to formulate our opinion about how men and women might behave or how they interact as we get older.
Mhm.
When you talked about now, like fast forward up until your current, the present, how would you say your relationship has fared over time
Mhm.
between you with your father and then you with your mother? Because we talked about when you were younger.
Yeah,
Do you think it changed? Do you think it evolved?
yeah, it definitely did. As I started to grow and get older, I found myself growing closer to my mom and further apart from my dad. Especially once I moved and just kind of became an adult. I do feel like my dad had these very specific ideas about what adulthood is for a child, and kind of that he it was his responsibility to pull away a little bit and let me figure things out on my own.
Right.
So he would still be very loving and supportive in our conversations when we would talk. He would always listen to me and give me advice and just comfort me when I needed that. But
Yeah.
he very much expected me to handle and manage things on my own. And he would give me props when I did that. For example, when I graduated college, which was amazing, my family came to Philly to see me. And whenever I walked out into the field, I found my dad in the crowd of thousands of people because he was jumping up and down in the stands until I saw him. And it was just such a
Yeah.
good feeling. I can still remember it so clearly. But
Yeah.
as to say, when I graduated, he told me, congratulations, this was nothing but you and God. You did it yourself. Because as a college student, I didn't ask my parents for money. They didn't give me money. They neither one of them went to college. They didn't really have any advice for me either. Like I wouldn't call them to ask them about classes or anything of that nature.
Yeah.
And I always really appreciated my dad for giving me the credit and the props that I did, figured out on my own and that was his expectation. That's what he expected for me. Whereas with my mom, like I said, it's gone the opposite direction where I find myself calling my mom and asking her for advice, which is not something I did ever. I didn't want to hear anything about what she had to say when I was growing up. I didn't want any kind of advice for her. I did not care what she
It's
thought.
like, no, thank you. I'm good.
Yeah, exactly. And then now as an adult, I find myself wanting her perspective often, and seeking her guidance and her wisdom on certain things. So it's been
Mm.
interesting because it has definitely, my relationships with them have definitely evolved over time and like kind of in opposite directions. And I think it
Mm.
kind of makes sense when I think about the roles my parents played in my childhood, with my dad being more of the emotional, caring, nurturing one, and deciding that
Mm.
I became an adult, it's time to give me that a little bit less. And then with my mom being the one who was kind of more of the strategic head of our family, now as I'm becoming an adult of myself and making my own decisions and managing things on my own, she plays a more involved role. So that's how I would describe it.
Yeah. No, that's to me that is immensely interesting. Like number one, going back to the roles because I talk about that a lot on this platform because a lot of us do grow up with traditional roles in terms of when I'm speaking to men, right? Most of us are expecting to be providers, to be disciplinarians, to be strategic, to provide stability across the board. Maybe not the emotional stability. That's usually what women would do or the mother would do. But the financial stability, the stability in the home, things like that. So we're already saying like not that dad didn't do that, but it just looked a little different for you in your household, right?
Yeah.
Now what's interesting though, you talked about with college. This is something I think that is in alignment with what a man would do or what a father would do, and maybe you would agree, maybe you wouldn't, but I'm going to give you my take on it. So a difference between a mom and a dad as a child gets older, once you reach adulthood and maybe to the point where you go to college and you're going to move away. In my experience, a mom's going to have a harder time to deal with that
Mm-hmm.
because they're usually the ones that are more emotionally attached in terms of when things go wrong, they're usually the person that you run to. Now, not that you don't go to dad, but we tend to go to dad for very specific things like I might be going to jail. I need money. Like somebody's threatening me, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
More threat of like personal safety.
Mm-hmm.
Emotional stuff would usually be mom. But when you said, okay, but my dad was really emotionally tied to me and very close to me, but then he started to pull back
Mm-hmm.
because he understood that I needed to be more independent, right? That is in alignment with what I would say most dads would do because we understand that that's important for a young person to learn to stand up on their own,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's interesting that like so there's aspects you're saying that he would, I would say, quote unquote, be more traditional in, but then there's other aspects where it might look a little different because mom assumes some of those roles.
Yeah.
And then coming back full circle, and you're saying now I'm a bit more closer with my mom because I want to ask her things about life. I want to ask her more about her experience. I think we can never discount that because you being a young woman, of course, to a certain degree, you're going to ask your mother because she is an adult woman.
Mm-hmm.
She's going to have lived experiences that you have not. Not that you are the same person, obviously, but there's some commonality there that maybe you can gain wisdom from her lived experience. Do you think that's at all part of why you've reached out to her more, maybe in these later years?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And I think I remember when she would try to give me advice, teen me or even adolescent me.
Yeah.
At that age, I was like, whatever. But now as an adult with more maturity and a little bit more wisdom, I remember certain things she told me and they've proven to be true. So
Yeah.
now she's kind of established credibility with me in terms of being someone that I can look to for guidance. And that really started, I feel like I got to that point around 22, like graduating college and going into the adult working world. I was like, oh, wow, life is, you can have a lot of book smarts, but there's just so much you don't truly understand or have a grip on until you get out there and you start experiencing it yourself.
Oh yeah, it's a very different lived experience, and I appreciate you saying that. I have a lot of conversations with some of my younger clients who are in like around your age demographic, and for as many of them, and I get it because I remember feeling like that too. It can be very intimidating and very terrifying because it's almost like high school to college is like a really big safety net to a smaller one. You're not completely by yourself, but it's definitely less than what you have in like K through 12 education.
Mhm.
But then when you leave college to the real world, which is why we say it like that, it's like all the training wheels came off, all the expectations come on, and you really got to know what you're doing. And if you don't,
Yeah,
you better be being in contact with people who can help you.
yeah,
So we talk about that concept of adulting that a lot of people like that. Just the fact that that became a term. Like when I was growing up, that wasn't a thing. It was just a part of you becoming an adult. But the whole fact that that became a term is us trying to wrap our brains around, man, this is hard. Paying bills, being responsible, having effective time management, being patient, being a good listener, making sure I can keep my job, like all these different aspects that are required for all of us. And that's before you even talk about relationships and marriage and parenting.
yeah,
It's very complicated,
definitely.
right? So I appreciate you saying that because I know a lot of young people that I work with, that's very much a topic that we end up discussing because it's hard for them to really learn how to manage that. And if you didn't get some of those skills, we could say when you're younger, like maybe 16 to 18, it's probably your bread and butter because you're
Mhm,
just getting ready to get out the door.
mhm.
If you don't start getting challenged like that, then like going to college can be a huge wake up call. And then post college can be even more of a wake up call because there's so much more that's expected of you because you're so much older and removed from high school. Do you think you've had any part of that experience, when you left Pennsylvania?
Yeah, I would say I think living by myself was really the first time where I was like, oh wow, this adult shit is it's really something. In college I had roommates. When I lived in San Francisco for my first job, right after graduating, I had roommates, and I had roommates up until I moved to Miami, where I live here alone now. And I would say that was the biggest wake up call for me in terms of just managing life. It's very difficult to do it by yourself, especially when you work full time, like working full time and keeping up with
Facts.
keeping up with everything in your apartment. In fact, it made me realize I'm like, wow, I understand why I had so much responsibility as a child because it
Mm-hmm.
really does take a village. Like there are,
Yes.
but living by myself, I find myself being late for things, for example, by accident, just because I'm keeping up with so much, or something goes wrong with my dog and I'm the only person here who can do something about it. I don't have an extra set of hands to help me manage random things like that, or
Yes, ma'am.
random emergencies that crop up or things of that nature. So I would say that's probably been the top struggle, adulting struggle I've had is just learning how to manage everything, manage
Yeah.
a household by myself, even with just me and my dog. That's my little family unit. It's still a lot
Yeah.
to manage by myself. And then I would say the second thing is the lack of a clear path. Because to your point about
Mm.
kind of the safety net, there, in high school, there's kind of a clear objective. You are seeking to go to college or going into the military or going into the workforce. And then if you do go to college, it's the same thing. There's a clear objective. You're seeking to find a full time job once you graduate. But then
Correct.
you find that full time job and you're an adult, and it's like, okay, now what? There's no, I'm not going to graduate from my job and move on to something else. There's no my manager is not going to hold my hand and walk me through the process of getting promoted.
No,
So
ma'am.
I
No,
would say
ma'am.
that is there's just a wide open world of possibilities, but it comes with a pressure of just you're in the driver's seat. The ball's entirely in your court, and
Absolutely.
in charge of you anymore, and it all comes down to you. You can't blame mom and dad if life doesn't work out the way you want it to. Whereas in high school or
Hmm.
college, I could be like, God, my parents are just like, oh, you don't have that luxury. So
keep passing that responsibility on. It's like, oh no, they screwed me over. That's why I'm having all these troubles still.
yeah,
No, it's so true, man. You hit so many good points. I'm gonna try to break that down, because when you talk about responsibility and a part of being older, and then the last point you were mentioning about trying to create a vision of a path, right? So you get out of college, and like you said, the goal for many is to start working. Now, I would say to you, based on my lived experience, I think right out the gate, just for anybody who doesn't know or who hasn't gotten to this point yet in life, I think it takes about the full duration of your 20s to really come concretely figure out who you are.
Mm.
And the reason why I make that point is because if you don't really know who you are, then it's really hard to figure out the direction that you want to go in your life. Now, that doesn't mean you can't make big decisions in between then. It just means that understand that there's so much about me that's probably going to change in this first decade, like post high school. I think it's important to understand that. And then as a part of that, trying to figure out then what I want from my life. This is when we get into the very interesting part. And I'm kind of going out of order, but you prompted it out here, so I got to go with it. To me, that's where we start talking about relationships. Because when school's done, when work's done, then the question then becomes, what do I want? What else do I want? Do I just want to do this until I die or until I retire? Or do I want a family? And then if that question is yes, if I want the family, what does it look like? Do I want a husband? Do I want a wife? Am I indifferent? Do I want children? All of these different aspects I think are very important for us to understand. One thing I would say to you, and I think this is really important for those of us that, and I'm not going to use you, I'm going to use me in this example. If you grow up and you don't necessarily have the best visual examples when you were growing up, that you saw exactly how you wanted it to look. I saw my dad, I saw my mom. He treated her like this, she treated him like this. It was lovely. We had these kids, we had a dog. I want that, right? What happens when you don't have that? I got to get it from somewhere. Until I figure out what that example might look like, I might make some mistakes in some of the people that I deal with because they weren't in alignment with the vision that I had because I had no vision. Because nobody coached me on how to have a vision. So I want to ask you in segueing off of that point, because I think it's very, very important what you're saying. Once school's done, once I have the career that I want, for the most part, what comes next for you specifically?
For me specifically,
And
interesting.
it's okay if you don't have a clear answer. We're just talking it through because I think it's important to entertain this topic.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a great question because I haven't really thought that far. I've been thinking a lot lately about what I want in my career and where I see myself 5 years from now in terms of my career.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't really thought much broader, primarily because it's really hard to say. I think you're totally right about you. It takes a decade to feel like who you really are.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember if I told you this whenever we first spoke, but for my
Yeah.
25th birthday, I went on a solo trip for the
Oh,
first
okay.
time by myself. And I've traveled by myself before, but always to a destination to meet people. This
Yeah.
was my first time going to a destination just to be there by myself. And I went to the Florida Keys. I stayed in a hotel. And my first day, it was so eerie because I had no idea what to do.
Right.
Without the distraction of having a home to take care of or work to do, or I was like, what am I going to do? How am I going to spend my time? I had no idea. And it was such a weird feeling. And it really opened my eyes to how much there is still for me to know about myself. Like I'm
Yeah.
on vacation with all the freedom in the world and I have no idea what I want to do. So I would say I'm still kind of in that space right now. I know that I would like to have more of a community, a stronger community for myself at some point. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something I've been taking steps to work on, but it's not easy. And I think partially because of just identity, like we've spoken about before, and when your identity is different from that typical person's,
Yeah.
or just or you don't necessarily fit within a certain category or a certain box, it can be hard to find people who you feel like you really connect with. Uh,
Absolutely.
so I'm kind of thinking out loud to answer your question, and I feel like I've arrived at the point of when I'm settled in my career, the next step for me would definitely be community,
Okay.
and not in kind of a broader sense, whether that is a really good group of friends or a really strong professional network or a really loving relationship. You know, ideally all of those things. Ideally that would
Sure,
be my whole
sure,
community.
sure.
But I'll have to build it piece by piece.
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's the tricky part about this, and I've tried to, even my own thinking has evolved on this a bit, because I didn't have always the best examples of what to look for and how to determine what that future really would be. Because like you said earlier, we're in the driver's seat, so we're determining to a certain degree what the outcome is going to be. No, obviously not about other people. We don't necessarily influence or control them, but whether we want to maybe be with a certain person, if we don't put ourselves out there, we'll never know. So I asked that question because for a lot of us, I think it's very tricky because we're sort of balancing this scale, if you will, of a sense of independence of self, right? Like I can take care of myself, I can do things for myself, I'm fine. At the same time, with that, what did you say a little while ago? It's hard because I'm doing it all by myself, right? And then maybe on the flip side, you said community. Community might include family, friendships, romantic partners. I would ask you this question: do you think it is imperative for us, particularly if we're in your age, right, to be very intentional about, while I'm pursuing my career, while I'm trying to make sure that that independent side is sustainable, it's very self-sufficient, that I'm putting equal effort into the community aspect? Do you think that that's important for you?
Yeah, I do think it's important. And I think to the point of being intentional, I think it's important to determine what that looks like for you
Hmm.
in the moment in time that you're in.
Hmm.
And I say that because I realized I wouldn't describe myself as someone who was boy crazy, but I noticed like I had my first like boyfriend when I was like 13 in like middle school, who I just was not allowed to see at all.
Yeah.
My dad was open to us like having dinner together with like a parent there, but my mom was like, not even that. Like you cannot see him out of school, and that's it.
Yeah.
Um, and so I had, like I said, I had my first little boyfriend when I was 13, and from that point forward until I was 23 years old, I was always in some kind of situationship. Typically a situationship, not really a real relationship. It was like some kind of,
Nothing defined.
yeah, right. It was
Got it.
typically some kind of strained on again, off again
Okay.
situation. And so that, that was a decade of my life, and I am a big journaler. I love journaling, and I've been journaling on a regular basis.
Shout out to journaling.
Woo!
Very important. Very
uh,
important.
right, yeah. It's like having a friend.
Yeah.
That's how I see
Or
it.
or like having a therapist when you don't have one yet.
Yeah. um, so yeah, I realized I was reading through my journals from age. So I've been doing it regularly since I was 20 years old. So like almost 6 years now of journaling almost every single day. So I have literally like 8 notebooks full of pages about my life.
Hmm.
And when I look at my journal entries from 20 to 22, they are entirely about men. Like nothing about my career, nothing about work, nothing about my values, who I am, my friendships. They're all about guys and my issues with them.
Hmm.
And so once I turned 23 and I got out of something that was just really silly and just such a waste of my time, for the first time, I finally looked at myself and was like, I don't think I have issues, but clearly I do. Like, clearly, if you look at the patterns in my relationships, there's something going on there that is showing me that I don't know how to be in a healthy relationship, and I don't know what that looks like or how to find it for
Mm-hmm.
myself. And so, since 23, which is, almost 3 years ago now, I have purposely been single and working on myself because I realized that there were just certain things I needed to change about myself if I wanted to attract better partners and be able
Sure.
to be in like, more stable long-term relationships with them. And so
Absolutely.
that's why I said to your point about being intentional about it, and just, the imperative of making sure you're thinking about that aspect, the community aspect, as much as you're thinking about your career.
Hmm.
I wanted to just share how, for me, that means actually focusing a little bit less, not even a little bit, a lot less on romantic relationships and more
Hmm.
on the relationship with myself
Sure.
first and foremost. But at the same time, I do think it's easy to over rotate. I feel like I have found myself in a bit of that position because I'm at a place now where I'm like, wow, I've been purposely single for so long. I don't even really know how, like, if I did want to explore something with someone, I don't know how. I feel like it'd be a little awkward. It'd be a little scary. Like, I don't know if, I don't know if I would be very effective at it. I feel like I would have to take some time to practice and ease back into it. So it's kind of a fine
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Love. I wish I need to clip that and have that on loop going over and over again, just to recapture what she just said for the audience here. So we're saying that. Well, I agree with exactly what you said. If I have been going through a pattern of, let's say, unsuccessful relationships, however you want to define those, I recognize that there's some things that I could probably be doing differently to get me better outcomes. So I'm going to be intentional and I'm going to focus on myself. Absolutely spot on. And then the add-on part, this is where it got interesting. So you said, but then I'm getting used to doing things on my own, taking care of myself, continuing to invest in myself, which of course is very important. But then I might be getting a little intimidated or a little frightened about what it might look like to actually be with somebody else. I find that to be very interesting because this is almost the crux of an issue that I didn't realize was happening, but the more I'm talking to people, the more I think it is becoming a real issue. I'm going to try to define something, and maybe you would agree with it. It goes to the heart of this concept of being independent. Okay. So I know for me as a man, I was always brought up and raised to be independent. My father was very, very clear on that. He didn't exactly explain why all the other reasons why it was important to be independent. He just said, like, for self, it's good to be independent. I have come to understand as I've gotten older that if I want a romantic partner, I need to be able to be independent so that she can feel comfortable to depend on me. That was not explicitly told to me, but I understand that now. The reason why I bring that up is because I want to present this concept of interdependence. When I say that word, what I mean is that let's use you and me for an example. So you're clearly an independent person. You take care of yourself. You provide for yourself, right? You talked about that up to this point. I do the same. If we were to be in a relationship, the way that it would look is that we are both making a conscious decision to rely on each other. It is not to say, I need you to do all these things because I'm incapable, I'm incompetent, right? That's not what we're saying. It's saying, I choose to work with you. Why? To go right back to what Shelby said in the beginning, because it is easier. Because life is already hard enough to do it by yourself. And when you're young, you have less responsibilities. As you get older, you get more responsible. Mainly, you get more things, which means you have more bills, right? More things to be accountable for. So then I would ask the question, when we maybe are being so built to be independent, which again, I'm not saying is a bad thing. But if that makes us lean so far into this direction where we get intimidated to go actually just try to be with somebody, healthy relationships, of course, but to be with somebody, why are we not talking about this idea of choosing to rely on somebody, not because it makes us less than, not because it makes it appear that we don't know what we're doing. We've already demonstrated that, right? We've already proven that we can do that. So it doesn't take anything away to say, oh, I choose to be in a relationship or I choose to be married or what have you. It goes to the heart of what you were talking about. It's easier. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, I do think it makes a lot of sense to me. And when you said the word interdependence, I immediately thought of my parents and their system and just the way their interests and their strengths complemented each other
Yeah.
really well. Even if it didn't fit into typical roles, it was just my mom had her personality and the way she liked to do things. My dad had his, and they worked well together.
Yeah.
But I definitely agree with you. It's not something that's discussed very often. I don't feel like I've ever, seen a headline about interdependent relationships or a tweet about it or anything like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say it's a concept that makes perfect sense, but I agree with you. It's not typically the way I think we discuss relationships or even necessarily how we think about them. I've
Yes.
just now been able to grow to a place of maturity where where I'm intentionally, when I'm writing in my journal about, maybe I have a crush on someone or I'm interested in someone, and I have written kind of qualities that I want in a person, like my non-negotiables, and then also
Mm-hmm.
that are kind of nice to have. And I like to, when I have a crush on somebody or maybe I'm chatting with someone, I like to go look at my criteria list and measure them.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I'll find not quite there. So it's like I appreciate it because it makes me, number one, it gives me more perspective on how I used to date before I had
Mm.
my criteria, and it was kind of just like, am I attracted to this person? Okay. And
Right.
now that I'm a little bit older, I expect more, I think about more, and I'll definitely add just this concept of interdependence. Like, could I see myself being comfortable relying on this person? Could I see myself
Yes.
being this person? Could I see what this person brings to the table, complementing what I bring to the table? That is definitely something I'll add now because of this conversation. So,
Good. No, I love that because I see us like when I have these conversations, and when I mean these conversations, I don't just mean these interviews. I mean talking to just people and even clients that I work with. I hear so much fear. Like that's like the main thing I gather when I hear people talk about this stuff is like I do this because I'm afraid. What if like we're waiting for people to pull the rug out from underneath us? Now, I understand that is scary. I'm not minimizing that feeling at all. That's absolutely a fair feeling to have. But if I operate my life like that, we can extrapolate that out to our entire life, actually. If I take that disposition towards relationships, how do you think that impacts every other type of relationship that I have? If I'm so afraid to be with one person, to have a certain level of reliance, again, a choice, but a certain level of reliance on them, why would I not take that sort of disposition towards that type of relationship and apply it across the board? I might not rely on my friends. I might not rely on my family. I feel like I got to go through life by myself because again, I'm independent, right? Everything's about me. But what is the whole point of why we're making this discussion? Because it is hard. If the pandemic didn't make it very clear, life is hard. It's way easier if you can find somebody that you genuinely want to be with, that you're open to have mutual dependence upon each other. Not codependency, not I lose myself and I have no sense of self. That's not what we're saying. But I have a sense of mutual reliance. I work with you and I help you in these areas. You help me in these areas and we work well together. Why can't that be more of the conversation? As opposed to this, I'm afraid to do this because what if he leaves? What if she does this? We don't get anywhere if that's the way that we look at things. That's a great way to be by yourself, probably for the rest of your life.
mm-hmm.
You have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would say I'm thinking a lot about what you're saying about the fear aspect, and the wheels have been turning in my head because it's making me ask myself, am I afraid of relying and depending on someone?
Mm-hmm.
And I don't necessarily have an answer to the question of whether or not it's fear, but I do know that I experience a lot of discomfort when I find myself being reliant on someone or expecting things from someone. Or even having them expect things from me in the sense of I do give 110, 150%. And I put this pressure on myself to like always be there, always be on, like be the strong one, be the reliable one,
Mm-hmm.
be the person who doesn't necessarily need others, but is the one that is needed. And so I feel like for me, I've definitely found just a discomfort when the rare occasion that I have found myself speaking or dating someone who is able to show up for me to the same level that I'm able to show up for them, I find it very uncomfortable. It's like this weird
Mm.
kind of like I don't have the control or the power in the dynamic because we're kind of equals to each other.
Mm.
Whereas when I've been with people who are emotionally unavailable, that feels more comfortable to me because there's no real intimacy there and I can kind of just walk at any moment. It's not going to be that big of a deal and not going to make that big of a difference in my life. So I guess ultimately it does come down to kind of fear, but
Mm-hmm.
for me it doesn't register as fear. It's just this sense of discomfort. Like I just feel
Sure.
really uncomfortable and anxious.
Yeah. No.
And that's like part of the reason that I have, like I described, purposely been single, because I just realized this pattern in my life where I was pursuing things that from the beginning were never going to work, and it's because that
Right.
was comfortable for me. It doesn't require like real intimacy or real sacrifice. It's just kind of,
Right
you know,
there.
just distraction.
No, I know absolutely, man. Again, you dropping so many gems right now, Shelby. No, that last part, that's so profound. What you just, I don't know if you fully grasp what you just said. To me, that is so profound. You said, yeah, so I'm seeking out people who are emotionally unavailable. If I could tell you from like an emotional aspect, the way I interpret that is I'm purposely seeking out people who are unavailable because that allows me to protect myself. It allows me to stay insulated. It allows me to keep my wall up, right? So then if that's true, I'm not you, so I'm not going to assume. If that was true, then I would ask, why perhaps do I need to be so guarded when it
Mhm.
comes to dating?
Yeah, I would say I feel like it directly comes back to just my experience growing up with my parents. I mean, like I've described them, I have such loving relationships with my parents and never ever doubted that I was loved and cherished and cared
Hmm.
for. They always made that clear, especially with their words.
Yeah.
But oftentimes their actions left me kind of on my own. My parents, in particular, when there was difficulty in their relationship,
Hmm.
they were not nearly as hands on with my sister and me. So my parents themselves had kind of an on again, off again relationship. It was strained with a lot of difficulty and mistrust.
Mm,
Fortunately, my parents they were always very loving with each other, and when they would argue and fight, there was never any kind of name calling, for example, or
sure.
anything close to like violence or anything like that. It was never anything like that. But they just did have such a strained on again, off again relationship with each other that had a direct impact on the relationship they had with me and my sister. Like when they were together and happy, then we had very happy, engaged parents. And when they were
Sure.
separated and fighting with each other, then, my sister and I were kind of on our own to care for ourselves and figure things out. And, having the needs that any child had, there would be a reaction that we were a burden, or at least that's how it came across to the two.
Mm,
Um,
okay.
so I
Okay.
think for me in particular, my issue is just that I feel like I have disorganized attachment in the sense of I'm just, yeah, it was just so like up and down with my parents and kind of unpredictable. The only thing that was predictable with the two of them was that they were going to be unpredictable. Like,
Mm,
I would never know if I was going to come home from school and like all my dad's stuff is packed because he's moving out. And then sometimes he would actually move out, or he would unpack it and he would stay and they'd work it out. It was just a lot of I feel like my world as a child revolved around my parents' strained, dysfunctional relationship. And so
yes.
as a result, as
Okay.
an adult, I am just very, I don't know. It's hard to describe. I guess I would say I'm like kind of hot and cold with people, where it's like I want to connect with them, but I don't at the same time. It's like I
No,
want,
no,
and then when I start almost getting there, I'm like, never mind, never mind. This is too
no.
much.
Listen, listen. I'm digesting everything you just said. Okay, let me make a point real quick, and then I'm gonna address what you said because it's burning in my tongue. I have to say it about what you just mentioned. So I believe so much in that our family environment and our lived experiences growing up really define the way that we see the world. It really shapes our perception for a very, very, very long time. Just want to make that point. So, what did Shelby just say? You said, I tend to seek out people who are emotionally unavailable and it's easy to walk away from. Then you just gave us, and I really appreciate it, a lot of good background about the way your parents' relationship was, what that dynamic was like at times, which sounded a bit chaotic, a bit emotionally unstable. And then we are, as children, we're witnessing that, right? We're observing all of that. What do you think is happening at that time? I'm formulating concrete opinions about how relationships look, even if I don't like it. It's becoming normalized to me. Do you think that there's a connection? I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think there's a connection between witnessing all of that as a young woman and the type of men that you've sought out and the type of relationships that you've had, situationships that you call them?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. I feel like The connection is just, it's the most obvious thing to me in my life. Like I feel like I've always been able to, or not always, but once I just hit a certain level of maturity, like I said, around 22, 23, it started clicking for me like, oh yeah, no, mom and dad, because I would laugh all the time in college. I would laugh to myself like, I'm surprised I don't have more issues, lol. And it wasn't until I hit that like kind of a little bit of a stride in the adult world that I was able to understand, like, growing up with watching such a having such dysfunction modeled for me, that
Hmm.
is directly correlated with the dysfunction in my own life now, in my own friendships, my own romantic relationships, even issues I have at work. I feel like are directly connected to just the dynamic with my parents. And I think too, for in my case in particular, just growing up with parents who didn't fit any kind of traditional roles or mold for the most part, including, not only in terms of gender, but also being an interracial couple in the deep
Right, right.
South, Mississippi. Like my parents just defied all kinds of, they really were just in a league of their own in terms of their relationship and their dynamic with each other. And so for me,
Yeah.
it's I haven't seen something comparable to that. Like I meet my friends' parents and they're totally different from my parents, or and I just see how my
Yeah.
friends handle relationships and their friendships and things of that nature, and it's totally different from me.
Yeah.
So, and I hope I don't. Sometimes I wonder too. I'm like, am I just like, oh, I'm so different? Like, I don't know. It's like,
No, 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 no. No, let's no. We can definitely speak to that. Are you different? Yes, you are. We all are unique in our own ways. But the reason why I can point some of these things out and I can understand is because there's a lot more things that we have in common than we really think we do. I'm gonna give you an example. So you were talking about, I'm thinking, oh man, how come I didn't have more issues? I saw so much. There was a lot of dysfunction, right? I would make the point to you that every family has a certain level of dysfunction because every family is unique. And there's things that we see that we believe are normal because that's all we know until you meet somebody else or you're around other people that challenge that type of thinking, right? I give you a perfect example, and I'll give you one from me. I was doing an interview with this guy, and he was talking about how he didn't realize until he got to college. For example, he's Dominican. He didn't realize that until he got to college that he grew up poor because he grew up in Dominican Republic and in New Jersey, and that for the most part, everybody around him grew up in similar circumstances, so you didn't really recognize any difference. But then when he went away to college, he started to deal with shame and embarrassment because he recognized that he didn't have the people that he was in school with didn't have a lot of the same experiences that he did, right? So that's him. For me, I had to learn how to, as an example, as I've talked about this before, decouple love with abuse. Because in my family, with my experience with my father, I always thought that those two came together because that's the only time like I heard him tell me that. So I allowed myself to be in relationship with somebody who behaves similarly because that's what I thought. Again, our environment shapes our perception until it gets challenged. And I'm saying that to you because you're making it very clear that what you experienced growing up and you recognize that has influenced to a certain degree the type of men that you've gone for, maybe even some of your career choices or the way you've dealt with colleagues at work. I'm going to make a slight segue because it's very much on the subject. Have, because you've been thinking about that and you've had that epiphany, have you sought out services from a mental health provider to help address some of those issues?
mm-hmm. Yes, yeah. I actually, whenever I started doing kind of a deep dive into my psyche and just became a personal development junkie,
Mm,
once I had this epiphany about my decade of, just to realize that I, at 23 years old, I had a decade of experience of situationships. I was like, this is really just completely out of control.
mm,
So I started reading a lot of self help books, and then once I and doing workbooks associated with them, and I felt like I reached a kind of a plateau in what I could do for myself, because I just found myself like still reading the books and doing the workbooks, but just like feeling so bad. I think the one of the most profound experiences I had in that kind of journey, a journey that I'm still on. I feel like it is a lifelong journey, and it's not. especially because we can't be perfect. It's literally impossible. So I just feel like
Correct.
developing yourself, it just really never stops.
Hmm.
But I learned that, especially for me, I had repressed a lot of the pain and the hurt I had from growing up in my parents' dynamic, especially because, like I described, I had very loving parents. Like they just were very physically affectionate, came to my soccer games and came to my award shows and showed me off, were super proud of me. Like I never doubted that they loved me to death. And so trying to grapple with the ways they failed me was very difficult for a lot of different reasons, because
Mm.
I was dealing with the pain and the hurt. I wanted to hold them accountable, but I didn't at the same time because I understood that they had done their best. I worried that I was just being ungrateful and bratty and just childish because,
Yeah.
I had parents who loved me. So why did it matter that they failed me in a lot of different ways? And once I started wrestling with that, and just not feeling like I was able to get to a point of peace by myself, I started seeing a therapist, specifically who specialized in like family trauma and specifically the mother daughter relationship, because I felt like that
Mm.
was really the root of the majority of my issues. I feel like for a lot of women, a lot of the problems they find in their romantic relationships can be traced back to their dads. And obviously, my dad wasn't perfect. There were a lot of things he could have done differently that I wish he
Mm.
would have done differently. But I would
Sure.
say, in my case, for the most part, the real issue was my relationship with my mom, and that my dad was actually the reason I didn't have more issues. I think I would have been a completely different person if he hadn't been in my life. If it had just been me and my mom,
Yeah.
and I'm so grateful for him. And at the height of my kind of struggles with my parents and my life with them, I didn't speak to either of them for a few months, about 3 or 4 months.
Mm.
And then once I was ready to start speaking to them again, I told my dad, I don't know who I would have been without you. And my dad's always been like a really lighthearted, funny, like very deep emotional person. But with me and people around him, he was just kind of a jester, like just good guy, like really
Yeah.
positive, optimistic, funny, happy-go-lucky guy. Never got too deep. And when I told him that for the first time ever, he sounded really somber. I had never heard him sound so somber. And he told me, "Thank you. I really needed to hear that." And so it said to me that, my parents are also aware that they haven't done, that they messed up, even if they can't necessarily say it or be the people who initiate the conversation. They know.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I feel like I've kind of like trailed off and around here and there, but that's my
No,
answer.
no, 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 no. I'm with you. I was gonna say because it is very difficult. I talk about this concept in terms of we call them dialectics when you're holding two truths at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
I can say to you, for example, like I just said a moment ago, that I had this warped view of love because of what I experienced with my father. But I can at the very same time, so I can hold that in one hand. But at the very same time, I can also give my father a lot of credit and say he had to provide for two children by himself because my mom passed when I was very young. And that's a lot to ask of any one person to do. We just talked about being responsible for ourselves and a dog, right?
Yeah,
Let alone two children. So
right.
I can hold these two truths at the same time. I can give him credit for what he did over here, which is phenomenal, and also say, this didn't need to happen.
Mm-hmm.
This screwed me up. This
Mm-hmm.
made it really hard for me to develop healthy relationships and have a good view of how to deal with people. You get what I mean?
Yeah,
We can do both
yeah.
because we are inherently complicated people. We're not, we like to put things in black or white because it's simple. We like to oversimplify things because it's like, good or bad,
Mm-hmm.
good and evil, right or wrong. But a lot of stuff is gray.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of stuff is gray. So you have to look at the context of the situation. You're saying, dad was good for the most part, but there's some areas I wish he would have did differently. Mom, I appreciate the aspects about what she did and how she raised me, but there's definitely some things that contributed to the way that I deal with people and myself maybe now. So it's okay to give ourselves the whole story, because if we don't, the worst thing we could do is lie or mislead ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the worst thing we can do, because then we don't make the changes that we need to make. To go back to your earlier point about being selectively single, if we don't do that work on ourselves now and not attribute it to anybody else, we might have gotten a lot of those mixed signals from our parents, but at some point we got to take personal accountability, right? I'm an adult. I need to fix it. But if we don't do that, because we're deceiving ourselves, we're essentially ensuring a really long time of a lot of pain and hardship that
Mhm.
probably didn't have to happen. So that's a big reason why I like having these discussions and talking about this stuff, because I don't want us thinking that we can necessarily blame it all on our family, even though they might be the major reason why we see things the way that we do, which I didn't discount. At some point, we have to take accountability and say, no, but I got to do better.
Mhm.
I don't want to just keep replicating what I saw. Okay, I saw dysfunction. It didn't make sense. It's all I knew. But now I'm starting to know better. And shout out to you for going to therapy. I need to learn better so I can do better. But then the second part is the doing. Okay, I've understood. I got all this insight. I got all this awareness. Great. I'm doing my workbooks. I'm reading. Great. How am I implementing that into my life? How do I take the theoretical and make it practical? Well, at some point, I'm probably going to have to engage with somebody and not always be afraid that I don't have the control. Because the truth I would tell you, this is my way of framing it to everybody. And I'm going to use me as an example, because I think with parents and children is like the easiest way I think we get this confused. When we talk about control, right? A lot of parents I have to deal with that they think they have control over their children. And notice the way I said that. I said they think they have control over their children. I don't like to think about it in terms of control, because to me, the only person you can actually control is yourself. What we have is we have influence. We can influence our child. When they're young, the influence is so strong, it damn near feels like control.
Mhm.
Because when I tell you to do something, you do it. So it feels like I have that level of control over you. But what happens when they get to puberty? What happens as they start to get older and you start saying stuff and you're like, I'm not going to do it? What
Yeah.
happened? Did you lose control? No, you're losing influence, because now their peers rise in influence and your influence starts to drop. So it's not about control. We can only control ourselves and the way we see things and the way that we feel, right? So if I understand that and understand that it's not about control, then maybe when I choose to be with somebody or I choose to deal with somebody, I can go into it a little bit more open minded, open hearted, and in good faith. I'm not looking at it thinking, okay, you're trying to figure out how you can pull a fast one on me. So let me not even bother. So I'm going to be guarded, right? I'm going to have this giant wall up the whole time. And this is going to fail. But I still technically tried. I did
Mhm.
put myself out there, but I did it in bad faith because I knew that this wasn't going to work. That's why I was guarded the whole time. And I know I'm painting a very specific picture, but I'm curious. That's me trying to distill what I took from you. Do you think any part of that happens in your mind when you approach dating?
I think so. I will say I think it's typically more subconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think not just in my case, but for most people, like most people are not very self aware, which I
Mm-hmm.
have learned just from my own professional work. Like we discussed, I work in learning and development. And so I've done a lot of, I've created a lot of content and done a lot of research related to self awareness because it's a critical component in someone's performance on a job.
Yeah.
Typically the more self-aware you are, just the better outcomes you have in all aspects and areas of your life. And I learned in doing research about self-awareness that really only like 10 to 15% of the population is truly self-aware. And introspection doesn't always increase self-awareness either, because we often ask ourselves either the wrong question or we arrive at the wrong conclusions,
Mm-hmm.
and they seem correct to us because we've introspected.
Yeah.
A great example of this that I learned in my research is, let's say you have like a complete meltdown in a meeting, and so
Mm-hmm.
you introspect and ask yourself like, why did I have this meltdown? And maybe you arrive at the conclusion that you're just not fit for that position and you need to change your entire career or work at a different company, when
Mm-hmm.
really the actual reason could be your blood sugar was low, and
Yeah.
you don't even realize that. Like there are all kinds of things that are going on in our bodies and our psyche that we don't have conscious awareness of.
Absolutely.
So to answer your question, I would say I think yes. I think that is very much kind of what's going on for me internally, but especially before the last couple of years when I've taken just a step back from relationships and focus on myself, I didn't see it that way at all. Like in my head, I was doing everything right. It was genuine. I really, actually, really wanted to be with this person that I
Mm-hmm.
didn't actually want to be with, but I did
Mm-hmm.
actually want to be with this. You know what I mean? It's like a
Yeah.
kind of this weird thing where it's easy to ignore what's really going on inside and rationalize and deceive
Yes.
yourself, like you
Yes.
described. It's very, very easy to deceive yourself.
Oh yes.
Um,
Oh yes.
and I would also say, too, something that I was thinking about while you were speaking, to the point of, you can only control yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I think a really important lesson I've learned in my own journey is how difficult it's been for me to change, even wanting to, even putting in the work, even investing so much time and money and energy into developing and becoming a better person.
Yeah.
I still have my setbacks. I still have my moments. I will always probably have them.
Yeah.
um, and it's just made it clear to me that, or it's just given me a new perspective on when I am considering a relationship with someone, or if I do have a crush on someone, it's like looking at that person as they stand before you in that moment, and thinking about if that is what you want, and not
Mm-hmm.
not focusing so much on their potential and well, if they do this or if they change.
Correct.
Because the
Correct.
reality is, you have to want it, and even when you want it, it takes so much work. Like I've been working on myself for almost 3 years now, and I still feel like there's a lot for me to do and a lot for me to see, a
Sure.
lot for me to learn.
Sure.
So it's also given me that perspective of like, your your expectations with people have to be reasonable. Like you can't, the same way you shouldn't deceive yourself about yourself, you have to be careful not to deceive yourself about the other person as
Mm-hmm.
well.
No,
All of
absolutely.
that potential and the maybes.
Yes. No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's very important to really appreciate where somebody's at their particular moment when you meet them. But if they don't have the awareness and more importantly, the willingness to actually address their issues, that to me is a harder thing to find in a person. It's not that you can't go to therapy or you can't do your own work and recognize that maybe there's some things I need to change or maybe there's some things I need to do differently. But like you said, if I'm not willing to actually put in the effort necessary to change that, that to me, if you are seeking this person out as a potential partner, should immediately be a red flag. Because as you said, and I agree, we're none of us are perfect people. All of us will continue to evolve. There's much I still need to practice on because we are constantly trying to be the best versions of ourselves. Not perfect, but the better and best versions of ourselves. So we can be worthy of that type of person because we want somebody to match us. I'm putting in all this effort. I want you to be putting in all this effort, not theoretically that you walk that walk. You do it in a regular basis, right? So if I'm seeking that type of person out, I want to know that they are very intentional about putting in that effort and making that time. Not, as you said, thinking about what they could look like if they were to make these changes, because that implies that I'm going to present you with all this awareness. It's going to be so overwhelming that you just like, you know what? You're right. I never thought about it like that. Let me just go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way. You can give, and again, I see that in my profession. You can present somebody with information. It doesn't mean they're going to take it. That's why I said willingness. They got to be willing to hear it, digest it, process it, and then implement it. Right. So if I'm thinking about being with somebody, yes, I want to know based on how you present today. What do you look like today? What aspects have you addressed? What are you still continuing to work on? And then more importantly, where are you going? Do you have a path, as you talked about earlier, of what you want your life to look like? Because we're effectively sort of betting on each other, right? Because we're choosing to be interdependent if we're going to go that route.
Mm-hmm.
Not, I'm 100% relying on you. I have no sense of self and vice versa. But there's certain aspects I'm probably going to want to have you take over or have you help me with because I recognize that it's easier. It's easier for me, maybe if I'm Shelby or any other person, to bet on that person when you see them being so willing to address those issues, to listen and solicit feedback. How do you experience me? Is there anything you think I should be working on? Because I constantly want to be better. And I know that I have a very strong implicit bias, like we all do, and everything is not the way it appears, right? Maybe I want to take in that type of feedback from you. Maybe that's the kind of person that we look for when it comes to thinking about serious relationships. Because then I don't have to be so afraid.
Hmm.
That's a quality candidate, if you will.
Hmm.
Would you agree?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think too, taking time. I think that was a big mistake that I often made before in my decade before deciding to be intentionally single.
Mm-hmm.
Is I would meet someone and I would just immediately like them, and I kind of have this like almost like childlike. My therapist described it to me as like a childish innocence, where I felt like because I
Mm.
liked someone, that meant I could trust them. And so
Okay, gotcha.
because I started to like them quickly, I would just like jump right into it, not even really know this person. Or if what I was being presented was truly who they are. I had to
Right.
learn as an adult, and this is something I feel like I learned in literally the last year, is that people are not always who they say they are, and people
No.
can present themselves as someone different for a period of time. Like some people can keep it up for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had to, that's like been a key difference for me in how I do approach dating now. The rare occasion that I agree to a date and go on one, I in my head I have like my boundaries in place in terms of how I will handle this date. Like I will have like one drink max, for example, so I don't find myself getting, getting drunk and making decisions that I wouldn't make if I were sober.
Correct. Correct.
And things of that nature. It's definitely been a learning process for me in terms of just not expecting or assuming that everyone is me and thinks the way that I do and approaches things the way that I do. And also
Correct.
recognizing that it's important to really just take your time. And I
Mm.
found that that helps with like some of the fear and the anxiety I have about it. If I just tell myself, like, I'm just getting to know this person. I'm not,
Right.
by agreeing to a date, I'm not committing. I'm not saying yes to a proposal. Like,
Right.
we're
Right.
just here to have a conversation.
Right.
And so I feel like, and that's something my dad would told me once or twice that I didn't fully understand or internalize until I became this adult woman that I'm describing, who is more careful about the pace. Is
Mm-hmm.
like you have control of the pace. He told me that when I had my first little boyfriend. Like, remember that you're in charge of the pace, and I was like, what? I had no idea what it meant. My dad loves like talking riddles and metaphors, and that was he just like assumed that I would eventually figure it out and understand.
Yeah.
And so as a woman, that's like a critical, just like I guess aspect, or I don't know how to articulate it exactly, but just I recognize that as a woman, I do have most of the control, if you will, over the pace, and so
Yeah.
I do what I can with it to make myself more comfortable and remind myself to, like someone who has genuine intentions and is like really feeling me in that way is going to be okay with the pace that I'm comfortable with. And
Right.
someone who is pushier and more demanding, that's a red flag. That, if
Yeah.
they're not allowing me the time to get to know them that I need, then that's a sign that this person might not be a safe partner for me. So I feel like also just kind of learning, you, like adding tools to my toolkit in terms of,
Mm-hmm.
just practicing healthy boundaries that help me not find myself in these situations where I'm like, oh God, like we're dating now and I don't even like this person. Like, what do I do? I found myself in positions like that before. So,
No, we definitely don't want that. We don't want
yeah,
that. We want you to be actually interested and
yeah.
feel like you're comfortable with that person. And I agree with you. The pacing does matter because I think if for us or as men, if we really like a person, I think we will take our time. I think we won't be as much in a hurry
Mhm.
because we're looking more for the long term. Again, asking those important questions: what do I want for my future? I have an idea of what that path may look like. I'd hope to integrate somebody like you into it. So I need to be very thoughtful and intentional about evaluating this person, right? And hoping that they're doing the same.
Mhm.
I do want to go back to the point about the list because I think it was a very important point. I talk a lot about that when it comes to relationships in terms of deal breakers, understanding that there are certain things that are going to be I'm not going to be flexible on. Like I need these things, and if you can't do these things, then respectfully, we're not moving forward. However, my entire list of items cannot be deal breakers
Yeah.
because that would be unreasonable. right? There's always going to be points of compromise, and you said it, and I'm going to echo it, because everybody's not me. Everybody don't see the world that I do the way that I do. Everybody didn't grow up the way that I did. And I'm going to do my best to articulate and express how I feel and why I see things the way that I do. But just because I do that does not mean that you have to assume my way of seeing things. That's compromise. Because I understand that if I go into a relationship, I'm going to bring my perspective. You're going to bring your perspective. And we're going to try to find a way to meet in the middle. That's what healthy communication would allow us to do. Right. So going back to the list, what are some of those items that are on your list in terms of things that you feel would be a deal breaker for you that you cannot compromise on, and maybe some things that you feel you might be flexible with?
Mhm. My number one deal breaker is accountability. That's like the top number one for my list. To your earlier point about the willingness and how much that matters in terms of a person's just potential and ability to grow and change.
Mm-hmm.
For me, someone who cannot apologize, that's a deal breaker. And I am fortunate to have grown up with a parent who could and a parent who couldn't, and that
Mixed
was
bag.
yeah, right. And that was, a lot of the dysfunction that my parents' relationship had was a direct result of my mom's inability to apologize, and my dad's over apologizing to try to compensate for my mom not being willing to take accountability for her behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, that's number one. A number one deal breaker is like someone who cannot say that they're sorry or admit that they were wrong. I cannot be with that person.
Fair.
Another deal breaker for me is manners. I want to be with someone who is polite and respectful to me and to people around them. So, someone in any scenario where a man calls me out of my name, no, we're done. Because in all, my entire life, I never heard my dad call my mom out of her name or even say words like that around me and my sister or my mom. He wouldn't even use like the B word around
Mm-hmm.
us, for example, because it was just so considered so disrespectful. And part of that is my Southern upbringing. Obviously, like growing up in the deep South, manners are going to be
Yeah, of
top
course.
importance to me. So that matters a lot too. Like a man who refers to women as B words and has choice words about them, that's a deal breaker. I'm not, any kind of indication that there's a lack of respect for women in general. I am not going to deal with that. So those are my top. Those are the first things that come to mind when I think of deal breakers.
Okay.
I want to be with someone who can apologize when they're wrong, and I want to be with someone who treats me with respect, no matter how angry they are. It doesn't matter what the circumstances are. We should be able to have a respectful conversation. I know I'm capable of doing that, so it has to
Sure.
be like that with my partner.
Oh,
Things I'm
absolutely.
willing to compromise on, I would say, are more just kind of the more superficial things, like something that is important to me that I would like a man that I'm in a relationship to have is like style and being well groomed and really taking care of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say I don't like his style. Okay, I can deal with that. I might feel the urge or the temptation to try to make him dress a different way or wear certain things, but
Yeah.
I matured enough where I'm like, okay, that doesn't, even if I don't necessarily love his personal style, if he meets my other criteria, then
Yeah.
that's something I can just deal with. I can deal with, like, I don't know, maybe I don't even have an example, but
His
that
clo- his what, his clothing choices.
yeah, yeah. I've dated guys before. I'm like, what is this? And
Like what is like? What did you put together here, man? I don't even know
yeah,
what this is.
right, exactly. So that's an example of one where I'm like, it matters to me. It's something I notice, but it's not going to be a deal breaker if I don't
Okay.
necessarily like the way he dresses.
Okay.
I'm trying to think of another one that is like a nice to have, not necessarily a deal breaker.
What about, is there anything in terms of physical appearance or profession or salary or family dynamic, or like family maybe upbringing, or actually cultural background? I didn't even throw that one out there. Is there any of those that you're like, yeah, it would be nice, but
Good
like I'm
question.
flexible?
I would say that makes me think of one that is I would say this one is a deal breaker. Confidence,
Okay.
because I feel like a man with the confidence that I'm looking for, some of the other things like salary, for example, or profession will
Mm,
not be as much of an issue. Because I do feel like that is an issue I encounter as a young professional who has experienced a lot of career success already in her lifetime. And I'm 25, and I do make like, I'm in the top like 1 or 0% of 25-year-old women earners.
Mm.
And so, based on my like Googling of like, just because
Sure,
I was
sure.
curious. And so that is to say and that's another thing that keeps me a little bit pulled back from the dating world, is like that can be a big point of contention between a man and a woman, like the salary profession kind of stuff.
Yeah,
And so, and even with my parents, like my parents had a really good dynamic as it related to that, but they definitely had their moments where I could tell my dad's ego was a bit triggered by my mom being the one who had like more of the strategic control of our finances, and just kind of, realistically being the head of the household in terms of the way things were managed. I could tell that even though my dad was comfortable with her having that role, there were
yeah,
moments when I saw that it created like friction between the two of them.
sure,
And
sure.
so for me, I think I don't necessarily need to be with a man who earns more than I do or who has a professional degree, but he does have to be confident and not feel like threatened that maybe I would leave him one day for someone who does have those things, or feel
Sure. Okay.
threatened by my being someone who's ambitious and wants to have a successful career, and ideally one day I want to be a business owner. And so I need to be with someone who is confident enough to support those dreams of mine and not worry that me, being out and about in the world, moving and shaking and networking and just trying to do what I can to achieve my goals is a threat to his security and the security of our relationship.
Okay.
Um, so that's how I would answer your question. Where I don't have like a salary requirement or a professional degree requirement or anything like that, but I do want to be with someone who, if he feels he's equal to me, whether or not he has those things or whether or not I make more. I just don't want it to be an issue in my relationship, and I feel like the key to that is a man's confidence.
No, I can definitely support that. I think for a lot of us, I would say traditionally, for most men, we over identify with our profession. So like in terms of like if you ask them like who are you, the first thing we'll typically say is whatever we do. And so I think for a lot of us, if it can feel emasculating if your partner out earns you, and so you're trying to figure out how to navigate that. I don't think that's necessarily death to a relationship, but I do think you have to have very clear understanding about how each other's roles are. To your point about your father and your mother, so I don't know who out earned who, but if she's making majority of the decisions as a man, that might feel emasculating. So you might feel like I don't get to play the role that I was more or less built to play. And so it can be very difficult to maintain relationships like that because then we might end up butting heads more often, cause more friction. So I don't think it's necessarily that you have to have it like that. I would say historically, men would out earn women, and then not to say that women can't earn or can't earn comparably to a man, but I think sometimes there's again it either can go to this fear mentality or it can go to this I don't need you mentality, which is equally troubling because then it's like, well, then again, going back to the point that you were mentioning earlier, yes, of course, we can all do this by ourselves. That's not the point. We don't do relationships to say, I need you, I am incapable, like you're my dad or you're my mom. No. So let's just throw that whole argument or throw that whole position out the window. That's not the point of having this conversation. The point is to say it is easier, I would say it is more stable, particularly when you're talking about with families, because it is very, very challenging to do it alone. So I think if you make any compromises there, it wouldn't be a bad thing. You just have to make sure you have to have very clear understanding, for whoever you might give an opportunity to, so they understand what their role is going to be. Because historically, you being more of the provider, a person being more of the financial provider tends to make a lot more of the decisions or be the final say so. But it doesn't mean you're not supposed to talk and communicate and take in both sides before you collectively make a decision. Now, I want to add this part in there because we haven't gotten to it yet, but still on the somewhat on the concept of dating, we didn't talk about the cultural aspect. Just real quick, do you have a preference there at all or no?
No, I would say I have a really just like a range of what I'm attracted to. And really what it really comes down to is confidence. Confidence is like my top attribute. If someone is confident, even if I am not physically attracted to them at all, I
Mm,
might find myself being interested because of their confidence.
gotcha.
And so that is to say the same goes for kind of their background in all aspects, like their cultural background, their education, their profession, if they have the confidence that I'm looking for,
Yeah.
then I'm automatically like kind of open to other things being different.
Okay. Okay. Now, so let's take that a step further, but off the dating side now. We touched on it a little bit earlier, but I want to make sure we speak to this because, I'm sure there's plenty of people who look like me or like you who have similar lived experiences. So, can you share at all? I know we talked a little bit about it before, a little bit about what your lived experience has been like growing up biracial in Mississippi.
Yeah, yeah. So being biracial in Mississippi, specifically where I grew up in Mississippi, I grew up on the coast in a small town called Long Beach that is 90% white. And so it was majority white town, and then the other 10% is black folks.
Mm,
And specifically, growing up in the 90s, the early 2000s, in my hometown, my sister and I were the only two like light skinned black people in our hometown, really. There was one other light skinned black girl, and I say that because the fact that she was light skinned and not biracial was something that was always a topic of conversation in our hometown.
mm,
Uh, so that is to say, my sister and I were definitely considered kind of unique. We stood out. People would go out of their way to ask us, "Are you biracial? Are you mixed?" And we were also just treated differently by the kind of white establishment in our town. Like I always understood that I was regarded as different than black folks in our town. For example, my high school sweetheart was a white guy with a family who was not supportive of our relationship. And when I
mm,
would talk to people about it and describe that, his family is not comfortable with him dating me because I'm black, people in my hometown, their immediate reaction would always be, "But you're only half." And so I feel like it's a good example of how I was seen and regarded as different
yeah.
than fully black people in my hometown. And then when I left Mississippi and moved to Philly and was in a more diverse environment, I think Philly is like I don't know if it's majority a black city, but obviously it has a very large
Pretty
black.
close though, I would say.
Yeah, right. And Penn's campus is in West Philly, so I was like just in the most like the blackest area of Philly, I guess you could describe it as. And then that was the first time in my life I ever started being regarded as just like a black girl. Before, growing up where I did, I was always seen as I was regarded as mixed and biracial, which is what I am. And so that was an interesting thing for me in terms of my identity, and I feel like it definitely plays a role in some of my struggles with
Mm,
dating. My mom and I actually just had a conversation about this the other day where I said to her, "I'm black, but," and she cut me off and she said, "The world sees you as black, but you're biracial."
mm,
And that, and I'm sure, or perhaps you can relate being biracial yourself. It's like there can be a difference in the way you're identified by the
mm,
world, and the way you yourself identify, especially in my case, having a white mother. Like my example
yeah.
for femininity and womanhood is from a white woman.
Yeah.
And that inherently makes me different from a black woman who grew up with a black mom, regardless
Correct.
of how I look, or the fact that your typical person will not necessarily assume that I am biracial. In my
Mm-hmm.
experience, it's been like 50-50. Like, one in two people thinks I'm biracial, one in two is surprised when I mentioned it. So it really just depends.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is to say, I feel like my identity has colored a lot of just my kind of absent or lack of a community, and like yearn. I definitely yearn for that. I've always kind of wanted to find a space where I feel like I belong and where I feel like I fit in and people can relate to my lived experience. Because,
Yeah.
and the thing about being biracial is like even that's a broad category with a variety of different experiences. Like you and I are both biracial, but like I had a white mom and you had one that's Latina. So
Yeah.
it's just
It's
it
very
definitely
different.
adds a layer of complication on top of like everything else that we've discussed.
Oh yeah. No, it's and I appreciate you sharing a lot of that. It brings up a lot for me because I remember like you were saying trying to seek out community. I remember even as young as middle school and getting into high school, I remember I sought out people who were like me in terms of having parents from different cultural backgrounds because I felt like we had a little bit more of an understanding that even our parents didn't understand. My father certainly he never really tried to explain it to me, and I get it because he couldn't really relate. Um, But I want to go back to that point that you were mentioning because I think that was very important. The way the world sees us. So to be clear, if you're in the US, if you're half black, quarter black, a fifth black, you're black. And so it doesn't really matter how you see yourself outside of like maybe your circle. That's how the world will see you for the most part. Or I shouldn't say the world, excuse me. The US will see you. It's not true for the world. But in terms of how you see yourself, very important. So it's very complicated, right? Because sometimes we don't get to get the full experience of being immersed in both aspects of our culture. I know that's something where we're a bit different. I know I shared with you before that I got a good taste of both. Even though I grew up primarily with my father and his side of the family, the black side of my family, I spent a lot of time with my mom's side of the family. So I got a really good sense of what it means to be Latino and from their particular country in El Salvador and Central America. And so I feel like I got a good taste of both, right? For you, I remember when you were telling me, and that's something I thought was very profound, was that you really only got that experience and exposure to your mom's side. You didn't really get it from your father's side, the black side, which is an interesting dynamic because the world, or excuse me, the US is seeing you in that manner, but you might not even fully identify with it because you don't really understand it because of the lack of exposure. Is that a fair way to phrase that?
Yeah, definitely, definitely. It really wasn't. I'm really. This is another reason I wanted to go to school in a city, and that I was excited for Philly in particular because of the Black community and the culture there.
Yeah.
Because until going to school in Philadelphia, I have to be honest that I really did not feel like I felt like a black girl in terms of my lived experience, like we're describing, like the way the world treated me and the fact that I dated this man whose parents did not approve of me. So
Mm.
I understood that. I guess the way I would describe it is I really only stood the black experience in terms of racism, and that's it. Like I didn't really, outside of my dad, I did not grow up with any black influence in my life at all,
Yeah.
uh, or it was very, very limited. And it was, and also when it, the little bit that I did had, it was, I was often reminded that I was different. Like for example, my mom put my sister and me on a black cheerleading team when we were little girls in an attempt to kind of expose us to that side of our culture and
Yeah.
like make some black friends. And we just were, I have lots of memories of just being treated differently by, just even from the beginning, people weren't necessarily very friendly or welcoming towards my mom. They would be like kind of mostly welcoming and neutral towards my sister and me, but with my mom, it was kind of like, um, or they would make comments like my dad is very, very dark skinned. Like I feel
Yeah.
like probably has the darkest skin you can possibly have as a person.
He might have to compete with my dad. I don't know about that,
Yeah.
but anyway.
So my dad, he's dark. Um, and whenever the first time he ever came to a cheer practice, just to say hey to me and my sister briefly and then left, one of the moms looked at my mom and was like, "Oh, good thing you got him. He's too dark. He needed to have kids with a white woman to have pretty kids." And
Wow.
that just hearing,
It's pretty insensitive.
yeah, and we heard a lot of stuff like that growing up. Like my mom describes a lot of different comments like that from people, and it's
Yeah.
not something my dad ever talked about. And I can only assume that's because it was just hurtful. I feel like my dad. This is just me making assumptions based on things that my mom has told me and that he himself has said because he never told me this himself.
Yeah.
But I feel like he because of the darkness of his skin, he did actually feel like more at home, at least with my mom and her family, because it just wasn't a topic of conversation. Like
Hmm.
in my mom's family, there was no like dark skin, light skin. I didn't even have, I had no concept of that until
Right.
I started having experiences with other Black people and learning that, like, it's preferable to have light skin and curly hair and things. I didn't know anything like that until my interactions with other Black folks. And I will
Right.
say that it's just another testament to the I guess just like the stress of the biracial experience because there
Yeah.
is so much. I still experience racism from white people being a Black girl to them, and then within my own community, there's all these there, you know,
It's colorism.
yeah, colorism, and to have someone blatantly say that, like, oh, good thing my mom is white because I'd be ugly otherwise. Like, obviously, I remember that for I was 6 years old when I heard her say that, and I remember it for a reason.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I don't really have a major point there, but
No,
that's
no, 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 no. There is no point. It's just you being able to be open to share because a lot of us have those types of experience. And I'm not gonna go on and on and on because we'd probably be here for days talking about this because I could go in. I'm trying specifically not to, but I really want to make sure that you had the space to do that because I haven't had as many conversations yet with people like us. And when I'm meaning us, I mean people from two different cultural backgrounds and trying to understand what it's like to navigate that, especially if you don't get to, again, be fully immersed in one side of it. It's very hard when you're trying to figure out, again, going back to the bigger overarching point, to figure out who you are.
yeah.
It's hard to understand that. And when you have, like for me, I imagine, well, I hope, I can't say I know for sure. I hope my son won't have as much of a difficulty with it because I can speak to it. I can give some perspective on what it was like for me. Not that he's the same, not that we are the same, but I can at least talk about some of that lived experience. When you're not, you don't necessarily know what to say about it, other than the world's going to treat you like this. Okay, let's move on.
Yeah.
It's like no, there's a lot more nuance there, and I think it's important for those of us that are from those backgrounds, and especially those of us that have children, to make sure that we're open enough to share because think about what you were saying, like there was a lot of pain perhaps that your father held back
Mhm.
because he didn't maybe know how to articulate it. And I don't, I don't blame him. My father didn't say anything about it. Again, like when you don't know something, it's hard to talk about something you're not really familiar with.
Mhm.
So I get it, but at least trying to create an environment. Dad, mom, I heard this person say this to me, it made me feel bad. This person said this to me, what does that mean? Why did you guys choose each other? Like, did you not go through any challenges? Was there not people in your families telling you maybe it wasn't a good idea, or maybe they were open to it? Because I've heard different things, and I just want to understand. So it helps me understand who I am, so I can be confident in who I am and how I see myself, irregardless of how society may see me or may treat me.
Mhm.
Right? That's why I think it's important to have these conversations. So I sincerely hope that you are able to find that type of community that you're looking for. I do think, to put a more positive spin on this, I do think that there's more of us that are being created, which I think is awesome
Yeah.
because I think it won't be as taxing or challenging of a topic to engage in because you kind of at some point we're all going to have to, even if we don't want to, because it's so prevalent that you can't really escape it. It's like, come on, man, you're seeing so many different examples of different type of couples and different types of marriages and relationships. So it's not so scary anymore. So
Mhm.
let's make sure that we are fostering good dialogue, when it comes to that. So I think that that is absolutely going to be in the future. So hopefully it'll be a little easier.
Yeah, and kudos to you for being someone who is leading the charge in a way by having your own platform, inviting me, giving me space to talk about it. I've definitely tried to do something similar myself on TikTok, where I do create a lot of content and I
Yeah.
talk a lot about the biracial experience. And say things that I know people are going to have strong reactions to, because I think
Mm.
another thing I will say about being biracial is we're still the only race where people who are not biracial feel empowered to tell us who we are and what we experience and how we should identify. We're the only race these days
Yeah.
where that is acceptable. If a
Yeah.
white person cannot tell a black person, this is your experience and this is how you should identify. We all know that
Right.
that's acceptable.
Right.
Whereas when you're biracial, the community that you technically belong to, or like the majority side, majority to say that in mine and your cases, like we are
Mm.
identified as Black people, right?
Right. Right.
And so it's still, at least in my experience, it's very common for Black people to tell me like who I am and how I should identify and what I should believe and things of that nature. And
Mm.
like I said, when you're biracial, we're the only race where that is still considered acceptable. So something that
Heard.
I have been trying to do myself is say that honestly and
Yeah.
describe why it's a problem and be a little bit confrontational when that happens to me. Like there's a video on my TikTok where I say, if you are not biracial, you do not know what it's like to be biracial. You
Yeah.
cannot tell me about my lived experience, and you do not have to. And two, people sometimes will also like. I feel like the definition of biracial can get kind of murky too.
Right.
It's like, someone one time I said I was biracial, and a man asked me like, oh, like, you know, dark skinned parent, light skinned parent. I was like,
That's
no.
no, that's colorism, man.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, that's not being biracial. So I was like, black parent, white parent. And he was like, oh, okay. I was just checking because, some people say that if they have a dark skinned parent, a light skinned parent, they call themselves biracial. I was like,
You're just whatever you are.
yeah,
But
right.
yeah,
Yeah,
no, that's
exactly.
no, because there's inherently more challenge with what we're talking about. Because again, it's difficult because you're trying to fold in two different cultures.
Yeah,
That's what makes it difficult. It's
yeah,
not if you're from the same culture, it's not as difficult. Like, if you come from a more homogeneous part of the world, so you come from one country where pretty much everybody's like that. Like you said, your dad's derives from Nigeria, right? From his roots.
yeah,
So if we were all from Nigeria, it's like, okay, I have a light skinned Nigerian mom and a dark skinned Nigerian dad. You're still Nigerian. It's fine.
yeah,
We also
right.
understand the culture for the most part. It's not that complicated.
Yeah.
Versus when they're completely different. If your dad's Nigerian and your mom's French, that's going to be difficult
Hmm.
trying to figure out how to make those two merge in the benefit of your children.
Yeah.
So I agree. If there's some confusion there, yeah, let's put that to rest right now. That's not what it, what it means at
Yeah.
all. But to end, I want to ask you more about what you're trying to do for your future in terms of your own personal, maybe professional goals. Do you have any future ambitions in your either in your career or personally that you care to share?
Yeah, for sure. So, like I said earlier, I definitely want to be a business owner. Right now, my vision or my plan for how I will execute this is I want to do another year or two working in corporate America in my craft and just gaining a lot of experience and learning all that I can.
Mm,
While also just kind of like focusing on my personal habits and my free time, making sure that I'm using my time correctly to for my goals. You
yeah.
can't. I'm not going to become a business owner if I'm giving everything to my 9 to 5, and then in my free time just playing Animal Crossing and going shopping. That nature.
Fair
So my
point. Fair
plan
point.
is to. What'd you say?
No, I said fair point. Fair point.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I would love to in a year or two. I would love to start freelancing and just kind of building a portfolio of personal clients within my area of expertise, which is learning and development. There's definitely a gap for it here in South Florida. There aren't really, or at least I haven't found any like agencies related to it. So
Okay.
I would love to start freelancing and learning and development, and then ideally grow into an agency, a creative agency that also offers other services like social media and graphic design. Because I'm really into social media. I'm definitely a social media girl. And I'm learning graphic design just out of curiosity because I'm
Okay.
pretty creative and artistic as well. I love to draw and doodle and things of that nature. So I'm trying to get better at it, just improve and like learn some digital skills.
Awesome.
I mostly just do like freehanded stuff.
Sure.
So yeah, that's the vision and the plan right now. And then something else I would also love. I would love to be a boutique owner one day, like a little clothing boutique. I love
Okay.
fashion and clothes, and I like express myself via my clothes and also just like how I like interior design. You can see my house is like super colorful and so yeah, I would love to own like a little clothing boutique or maybe like some kind of interior design. I just want to be a business owner and doing a lot of creative work every day, and just being a good boss because that's something else I'm really passionate about. Just given the experience I've had in my career so far and the work I do, learning and
Sure.
development. Specifically, I focus on manager capability and leadership. So I have a lot of strong opinions about what it means to be a good boss and what it means to be a leader. And
Mm,
I do wonder if I'm just like naive and immature, because up to this point I've always like worked for someone and been a contributor. I've led teams unofficially before, like project
yeah.
teams, just clubs and stuff in school, but I've never like officially been a manager. So I am just curious if I,
How
you
would
know,
it work?
yeah, exactly. I'm curious. Like, I want to try my hand and see if I'm correct about these things or if I'm just like, am arrogant. So yeah, those are my career goals. I would definitely love to be a business owner at some point,
Okay.
and look out for my clothing line coming soon. Give me 5 years, I'll have one.
No, that's awesome. Okay. Now, just to clarify too, because I want to make sure I add, was there any other personal goals in there? Was everything professionally focused?
Yeah, I guess everything was professionally focused.
Okay.
Um, Personal goals. Yeah, I would say I would come back to what I said earlier. One of my personal goals was to just have a more of a community around myself, especially around the time that I like start raising kids, because I
Mm-hmm.
do really subscribe to the mindset and the idea that it takes a village, and I just want my kids to grow up cared for and exposed to a variety of opinions and cultures and experiences, because I think one of my greatest weaknesses is that I really see things from I can empathize with people, like understand why they feel how they feel or understand their feelings, but I have a really hard time accepting someone else's perspective as a truth.
Mm.
Like this
Whew.
concept that we all have our own truth. I have a really hard time accepting someone else's perspective as truth. Like in my head, my perspective is truth, especially because I trust myself. I know I'm an honest,
Sure.
trustworthy, high integrity person, and I don't necessarily know that about people around me. So sometimes
No,
in
that's fair.
situations, I only see it my way, and I only want to see it my way. Like I really
Mm.
trying to
Okay.
see it someone else's way will make me very very uncomfortable.
Ah, okay.
So
Okay.
I would say that's a personal development goal that I have for myself
Beautiful.
is being more flexible and open minded in that way, where I can accept someone else's perspective as a version of truth.
Yes. 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 Oh, I know I've made several videos on that because it's so important. It's so important. I talk so much about us not leading with all these assumptions
Mm-hmm.
because it really, really hurts us in the big picture
Mm-hmm.
because we're not asking enough important questions, particularly when you're talking about somebody else, right? It's different if we're talking about like a subject, something that's a little more objective, like a news story or a policy or a law, right? We can more objectively look at that and formulate an opinion and then talk about that, right? When you're talking about something personal, something that relates to that person, well, my bias tells me she'll be presented like this, so then I'm going to typecast her in this particular way, right? But that's my bias telling me that. I always say, this is my opinion, you may not agree, but this is my opinion, that I must always consider that I could be wrong about the way that I'm perceiving things. Why? Because I am not Shelby. I am not in her head and I am not in her heart. So, how dare I assume that I know what she thinks or how she feels? If I want to know, I must ask. And when she tells me what she thinks and what she feels, even if I disagree, even if I think there might be some shadiness to it, I need to accept it unless I've been proven otherwise at a later time, right? Because we want to give people the opportunity to be believed first in terms of when they're referring about themselves. If you ask them something like I've been asking you, obviously, tons of questions today, it would be sort of counterintuitive to invalidate everything you said, like at the end of this conversation. I know she said this, she lived like that, but what does she know? Like, how could I even be arrogant enough to think that? Like I'm not you. And if you tried to do that to me, I would say the same thing. I want us to be more curious and less sure, less judgmental, because we
Mm-hmm.
really don't know half of what we think we know about each other. Now, there can be some generalizations that I think are appropriate based on what you see, based on what the person actually tells you, right? Not that you made up in your head before they even sat down or before they actually spoke, based on what they've actually shared. But I found that we're not necessarily giving each other the space to do that. We're just sort of like, it presented like this, so then I think it was this, and then I go down the chain myself. So I'm going to feel like this, I'm going to behave like this, end of story. And I didn't really give that person a fair chance to present who they are. I just feel that that's very counterproductive. And I hope that as a people, as a society, that we can do a better job of that. Because if we don't change that, it's going to continue to have, I think we will continue to have this very tense, hostile relationship with each other that we see where people really don't listen anymore. We just make all these grand assumptions about each other and we say, I don't want to deal with people like that.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the hell that means. I don't want to deal with people like that. So, you stay over there, I'll stay over here. I'm going to be in my echo chamber, you be in yours. I really, really disagree. I can sit across from somebody who firmly disagrees with me and I will still be fine because I still want to understand why you see things the way that you do. You have a right to see it the way that you do. You could be wrong. I could be wrong, especially if you're talking about somebody else. Again, if it's objective, if it's something tangible that has nothing to do with people, then that's different, right? You can look at it and you're not going to have all this personal bias as much attached to it. Not that it doesn't exist. It's not going to be as strong. But when we're talking about people specifically, this is where I think where we get it confused because we just do so many leaps and bounds with all these thoughts we tell ourselves. And I think it just sets us up to be disappointed and ultimately alone. If we don't figure that out, nobody's going to tolerate. Like nobody who has their stuff together is going to tolerate that from us if that's the way we choose to behave. So I hope that, like you said, that I think is a beautiful goal to work on. And we all have to keep working on it. You don't master it fully. You keep working on being open-minded and accepting that people have different viewpoints than us. And that might not necessarily make them a bad person. We just might have some differing viewpoints, and that can be okay. I think we got to move away from this way of thinking that we must all be in alignment, lockstep with everything.
Mm-hmm.
If you deviate at all, you're a terrible human being.
Yeah.
You should just go away from me. Like I think we need to move away from that type of thinking. I think it's being quite polarizing and pretty dangerous, if I must say. I don't know if there's anything else you want to add to that point.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many. I know we're like wrapping up. I have so many thoughts based on what you said,
Mm-hmm.
especially around just like why it's a challenge for me. I feel like in
Yeah.
my case, it's a challenge because not trusting my intuition has gotten me into trouble many times. There
Yeah.
have been times when I have been right about something or someone,
Yeah.
and instead I've given them the benefit of the doubt, and it has resulted in serious consequences for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious about if you have thoughts or advice on how you kind of walk that line of, you know, being open minded and still being open and trusting,
Right.
but also protecting yourself when people aren't being honest or when, because sometimes you will have a conversation with someone and they,
Mm-hmm.
some people will just lie. There's liars in
No,
this
no,
world.
for sure.
And so
No doubt. No doubt.
So instead of continuing to share my thoughts, I'm curious about what you would say in terms of like, how do we walk that line? How do we trust people and keep ourselves safe at the same time?
No, for sure. I mean, and I think it's a very important question. I would say to me, I think a lot about that list that we talked about earlier, what's important to me and what I value. So I need to know that again, like let's say I have a list of 10 items and four of them are my deal breakers, four of them are the things I'm unwilling to be flexible on. So those four are the first things I'm looking for in a person. And if they are met so far, as we continue to interact, like we're fine there. Now, to go back to the point we were talking about earlier, not living in fear, there's a difference between being concerned so that way I know that I'm with the type of person that genuinely has good intention. And more importantly, not only are they verbalizing it to me, but they're also demonstrating it through their actions. And me being afraid that everybody might deceive me. So I need to always be on guard. I want to draw a firm distinction there because one is predicated on the idea that I only know as much as this person's going to share with me, which is true. That's everybody. But this other scenario is predicated on the idea that I've already sort of set the tone that I will be deceived. I'm just sort of waiting for when.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to draw a firm line in the sand there. This type of thinking, I think, is particularly destructive because it doesn't allow us to truly and authentically engage with somebody because I'm sort of assuming at the end of the day, again, going back to the assumption, that they're going to screw me. If I'm going into a situation, just to make it very clear for anybody who's thinking about this, if I'm going into any situation, it could be a romantic relationship, a job opportunity, whatever. If the feeling I have is I'm waiting for something bad to happen, don't do it. If that's the way you look at it, don't do it. Because you're like you said, your intuition is telling you something's wrong. Dive a little deeper and figure out why I feel the way that I do. Now, going back to the other example, if I also still don't know all the information, I only know based on what I'm being perceived. Why am I going to give this person the benefit of the doubt? Why am I going to try to act in good faith? Well, number one, this is my belief. You give what you want to get. I want trust from you. So I'm going to give you trust. Now, when I say trust, that does not mean that I turn off logic. That doesn't mean I don't look at evidence. That doesn't mean I'm not paying attention. That's blind trust. Nobody said that. I'm not over here like, okay, I don't see anything. I don't hear anything. Everything is fine. Only what she tells me. And no, we have brains, right? So when I say trust, and I like to define these words so we're always on the same page, I'm still paying attention. I'm listening to what you said. I'm paying attention to what you show me. That's what's informing my opinion and my perception of you, right? In totality. And at the more time I spend with you, the more that I'm going to learn and I'm going to understand that. But other than that, I have to give you that opportunity because I am asking for the same in return. You wouldn't want to be looking at me or me looking at you thinking, man, I'm waiting that she's going to pull the rug out from underneath me and she's going to deceive me. Right? Because you said earlier, what? I'm a genuine person. I give so much of myself when I'm in a relationship, right? That's what you said. I would say, hey, I want to receive that from you. So I need to make sure I'm mirroring that back as well. But you're looking all these observations about the things I'm saying and what I'm doing. You're formulating and putting all that together to draw conclusions, not assumptions, to draw conclusions based on what I see and I hear in real time. And we continue to communicate. That whole situation I just painted over here is way different than the situation I talked about over here, where I'm saying, I'm afraid, I'm basically certain that you're going to do something to hurt me. That's a completely different situation. This is assuring that it's going to fail. This one, I'm waiting to see based on what you show me. They're not the same. You follow what I mean?
Yeah.
So to me, that is the reason why it matters how you go into any type of relationship with anybody. Again, it could be a job you want to take. If you got these gut feelings and you don't address them, it's probably not a good idea to then move forward because maybe you are screwing yourself. Sometimes we put faith in people that don't deserve it because they were actually acting with ill intent, but we were being blinded. Again, we're not trying to turn off our ability to observe because that's not healthy. If this person said these things that go against the values I have, the things on my list, why the hell am I still giving them a chance?
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense. That is me acting in bad faith to myself. Mm-hmm. That essentially sets me up to have the other scenario. Yeah, I don't want it to fail, but man, I sure can't pick them, can I? I put myself in a no-win scenario. I'm not going to advocate for that at all. I want us to put ourselves with genuine people who genuinely want to be there and utilize all of their observations of the way that they behave with you and what they say, because the two go together. Because like you said, people can lie. Actions, we tend not to. Over time, you'll start to show who you really are if you're really not about it. But I put all that together. And then I make the determination, am I going to continue engaging with this person or not? Are we going to elevate this to a higher level of relationship or not? That is the big difference compared to just kind of giving everybody a chance, but then thinking that I need to still be guarded the whole time. Because then it basically means I'm never going to win, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think the point about behavior is really pertinent too, and probably my biggest struggle is I have ignored people's behaviors before because I like the words, I like what they say, I like the way it sounds, I like the way that makes me feel, and so I deceive myself.
Okay.
I can't say enough how much you just talking about self deception resonated with me because I've definitely found myself lots of times in my life where I have known better and not done better because I've chosen to deceive myself instead. And I will say too, when something I use that helps me a lot with being able to accept different truths is my little sister. I trust her a lot. I know she has my best intentions at heart. She, I think besides my parents, she loves me more than anyone else in the world. And so I will bounce stuff off of her. Yeah. And when she disagrees with me, I'm willing to consider it because I trust and respect her so much. So
there you
I feel
go.
like having a person like that in your life too, who you can trust to be honest with you when they disagree, and you can trust that it's coming from a genuine place. Like, she's not disagreeing with me because she wants me to get bad advice and then fail. Um,
Right. Right.
Disagree. She actually really disagrees. So that's helpful too. But I would say it's definitely something like what we're discussing right now
Hmm.
is probably my number one struggle in life at the moment. It's just constantly like, am I right? Are they right? Am I the asshole? Are they the asshole? Like, I'm definitely always trying to figure out like who,
I hear
what's
you.
going on in this scenario. So hearing your perspective, being reminded of the list, and to measure people against the list, and also pay close attention to their behaviors and do they align
Yeah.
with their words, like that's really the key, and not something I've always been the best at. I've definitely chosen to just kind of ignore behavior and focus on the word. 'Cause I'm a words of affirmation person too,
Well,
so
okay.
you know
Beautiful.
it's
No,
easy for
no,
me to
no, no.
get distracted by things that sound good.
Exactly. No, it's so good that you said that though. I appreciate that. That's good self-awareness, right? For those that didn't catch that, she said words of affirmation are basically her love language. So that means that if somebody says certain things to you, it's going to impact you greater than probably would me. See, I'm a quality time, physical touch type of person. But more importantly than that, I'm an actions driven person. I've had to learn to be more expressive verbally in terms of how you feel about a person. Um, because of the way that I grew up. I feel like I grew up with a hypocritical father. So I didn't really trust words. I only trust what people do. And I've had to learn to balance that a little because women tend to like what they want to hear your feelings and hear you express it to them. And so it's interesting, but it's important to balance the two. But I think the behaviors to me, it weighs more to me specifically because it's harder to fake that for an extended period of time. Like words, I feel like you can more or less effortlessly deceive yourself or deceive somebody else. But your actions, it takes a lot more effort to put up this facade and maintain it if you really are not about it. Like if you say you like somebody, but then your actions start to, they start off high and they sort of go down over time. That's more, I would say that's more expected when you have somebody who's not genuinely interested. But with words, it's easier to keep it static. It doesn't take as much effort. So I do value both. I do think it's important to do both. But the behavior and the action side, I think it's harder to keep that up for a long time. And so if somebody's really not serious about what they're saying or about what you both are looking for, then you can more quickly make that decision and then move on before you get more significantly emotionally invested, So it's a very interesting topic. I know it's very difficult to wrap our heads around at times. I'm by no means an expert in that area. I just have had a lot of lived experience and work with a lot of people who struggled in those areas. And so I like to talk about it because I think it's important. This is how we learn. This is how we can grow. Not that, and to go back to your other point, um, our perspective is not the perspective. It's just the way that we see it. Our bias is really, really powerful to the point that it makes us think that everything we see is exactly what it is.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not true. It's not always true. It doesn't mean you can't have an intuition. It doesn't mean you can't trust how you feel. But we got to bake in a little room to consider an alternative viewpoint
Mm-hmm.
because I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk to people, even I don't like to talk with always certainty, especially when it pertains to how somebody else feels or what they live through or how they see things. I ask, this is how it appears to me. You tell me, is that what you meant? Because that can save us a lot of hardship and a lot of heartache if we get that clarification before we keep going down this chain of now I'm upset, now I'm hurt, I'm disappointed, I'm fearful, I'm avoidant, and now my behavior is I'm guarded. I don't want to hang out with you anymore. I'm going to be hot and cold. You can't build a relationship like that. That's not sustainable. You want somebody to be around you and be able to be their authentic self more often than not, right? So I have to be very mindful. You have to be very mindful. All of us have to be very mindful that we create the environments to be open, to be honest, to communicate effectively. And when we're trying to seek out somebody, to be thoughtful about how and who we give that opportunity to. Because again, if you said we see the red flags or we see concerns that don't match up with what I'm looking for, don't give them the opportunity or cut it off relatively quickly when you see that it doesn't match. We need to make that executive decision. Otherwise, I could be setting myself up for that other scenario where I'm basically waiting to be uh, proven that it is what I thought it was going to be. That gives me what we would call a self fulfilling prophecy, that I said this is what was going to happen. And then everything I do and everything they do is in alignment to make that be true. But that's not healthy. That's not healthy. That just helps us get what we ultimately don't even want. But we're setting ourselves up to get what we don't want. That does not make sense. Hopefully you would agree with me.
Yeah, no, I do completely agree with you. And I think I was thinking of this to your point of before you even said it, I was thinking about how this is exactly why it's important to be selective because all that we're describing, it takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of
Yes.
mental and emotional energy to
Yes.
really pay attention and observe someone and get to know them. So I feel like one of the a problem that I had early in life is I just wanted as many friends and as many people around me as possible. And so as a result, I wasn't doing my due diligence and I was willing to tolerate things I shouldn't because I just
Gotcha.
felt like having a big friend group and looking popular was worth more than like truly being valued and cared for and having like
Understood.
real deep intimate relationships. So I think the point you made about being thoughtful and intentional about who you allow into your life matters a lot too, and it is especially relevant for people in my age range because we are 25 is around that age where you do start to kind of grow up and shed some of your college friendships and maybe even childhood friendships because you're growing and evolving and changing, and other people may not be doing the same at the same pace, or you're going in different directions from each other. So,
Yeah.
I think the point of just being aware that I think it's just reality that quality relationships, if you want really quality relationships, most of the time, less is more. Because you
Yes.
really can't, what we're describing, you really can't have that with, a group of 20 people. Like, you're not really going to have a real intimate, like, bond, know each other for real in a dynamic like that.
Yeah. I'll try to make one last example before you wrap to speak to what you just said. I would say quality over quantity would be the theme there. It's kind of like the idea, maybe this is true for women, maybe, but I'll speak for men that I know, especially when we're younger. It can seem to be very desirable, excuse me, to juggle multiple women at the same time. And it can be fun. I'm not going to sit here and act like I haven't done it because I have when I was young too. But I say that because as you get older, to your point, you recognize that you can't invest as much into each person. It's a much wiser strategy. It's like the idea of multitasking, very much in alignment. It's much better of a disposition and a way of approaching things to focus all your effort and energy on one person and make sure that if this is your person, great, like keep going. If it's not, okay, cut your losses, maybe do some reflection, and then try again, because you're gonna give the most complete version of yourself. Why is that other way not as good of a strategy? Just like multitasking, because I'm only giving a piece of myself every single time. I'm giving like this little bit of attention and this little bit of attention and this little bit of attention. But at no point do you really get all of my attention. At no point do you get all of my effort. At no point do you get all of who I am. That's not a good strategy, particularly talking about mate selection.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a good strategy. If you really want the best outcome where you're going to find somebody of quality, of value that you really appreciate and that you're willing to go through life with this person, I think we should take our time and be much more thoughtful about one person and giving them all of that attention and seeing what comes of it. It doesn't mean it's always going to work, but that's me doing my due diligence, to your point. That's me giving enough effort and enough time to make sure that I've seen this through. I'm not trying to operate based on assumptions. I'm trying to let this person present who they are and learn about who they are, and as well as show who I am. And if that happens to sync up well, maybe we have something. What do you think about that?
Yeah, yeah, I think it makes sense. I now have another question based
Okay.
on what you said. What do you think is so? I I agree, and that's typically my dating strategy where I like to just focus on one person at a time and really get to know them. I really do not like dating multiple people at the same time. I just genuinely don't like it and find it stressful, and it's just not for me. But I've often been told that if you do date like two or three people at a time, being able to compare them to each other can help you be more objective in terms of who's the better match for you. So I'm curious about your thoughts or your perspective there. Like
Mm.
what is, and I don't mean like, purposely having like a harem of, a roster the way it's often described. Like I don't mean like purposely having a roster just so you always have like, a steady.
Yeah, you're just cycling people through.
Yeah, right. But do you think it is a good strategy to date multiple people at once, at least maybe in the beginning stages, just so you can be more objective, or is it? I just what do you think of that?
Sure. I mean, I think there can be a value in, especially when you're first getting started, right? When it's very, very casual, like no expectations. I can see a value and a benefit of maybe having two or three people that you might be talking to at the same time because you're not taking it as serious yet because you're still very much just trying to learn about somebody, right? What to me, what would change is as soon as you start to feel a little bit more of a connection that I'm starting to see that this person is a bit more in alignment with what I'm looking for. Not that these other people, let's just say we're talking about three people, right? So one of these people um, immediately gave me that feeling very quickly, like uh, third date.
Mm-hmm.
So now the other two, they're sort of falling to the wayside. Not that they're bad people. It's just that I feel a stronger connection with you. What I would say is if I'm going to hit it from that sort of approach, if I had three, I'm going to immediately put those other two to the side and say, you know what? I need to focus on you because you seem to be more of what I'm looking for. And then being willing to maybe be open about it. I think if you are both engaging in a similar sort of way of approaching dating, it's probably not going to be strange. But to say that, like, yeah, like I really want to focus on you and what we have going on here because you seem much more in alignment with my values and what I'm seeking for my future. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. However, if somebody told me I don't even want to do that, I just want to do one at a time, I think that's absolutely fine too. I think there could be value to doing both. Again, there's not one way to do things always. So I do see that there would be value in approaching it that way as well. I just think you have to be very intentional. If you're just cycling people, as you said, just to have, they're like, yeah, I got Shelby on Monday. I got Monica on Wednesday. I got Tatiana on Friday. Like that to me is, that could be more about your ego than about you being genuine. If you really want to find somebody, I understand you might have to date more than once, no doubt. But if I'm really starting to feel something with this person, I'm really starting to see that they are more in alignment with what I'm looking for. I think you have to be honest with yourself. It would be wise at that point to cut them off. Yes, you risk losing them. So is the nature of dating.
Yeah.
But if I think I have a better connection with you and I think I have a better shot of this working with you, I would say I think we need to put all our eggs in that basket and really give it a chance.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's more fair to the other person too, so they're kind of cut loose and able to try to find that on their own. Um,
Sure.
the person that they have an actual real or better bond with, because that's
Yeah,
like the primary reason I don't like dating multiple people at the same time is I don't want to lead anybody on or
absolutely.
confuse anybody. So
No, absolutely. I think it's a very important and poignant question. And, it just goes to the nature of dating. It can be very complicated in how you approach it. I just think number one, we just have to be very genuine about what we want and what we're looking for. We have to be willing to articulate that to that person, obviously have them do all these things in return. And if we are being honest, I think the process doesn't have to be maybe as long as we think it does to determine if we want to continue seriously dating this person. To go from casual to being much more serious, right? Because that speaks to the heart of what you were speaking about much earlier on in this conversation, talking about situationships. To have a situationship, from my experience, is we don't have those conversations.
yep,
We don't
exactly.
we don't we don't we don't we don't even talk about them because I don't really care about what your values are. I don't really care about what you want or what you're looking for. We're keeping this on the most primitive way that we can, which is purely physical attraction. And you fulfill this need, that's cool. And we sort of leave it there. But what we have been talking about evolving from that point is, well, what about when you want something real? What about when you want to build a life with somebody and you really want to build a family with that person? Do I want to operate from the mentality of a situationship to build that? Probably not. probably not the best way to get me the best outcomes that I would look for. And I'm very outcome based. If you're doing things that you're not getting what you want, change your process,
Mhm.
change your approach, or consider at least changing some part of it. Because if you're not seeing what you want, then it means some part of your process is flawed, and we all do it. But I think it's important to be on the same page and again be authentic about what you're looking for, so that way when you are out here trying to find somebody, that you're streamlining the process as much as possible, but you're also giving yourself an honest chance to get to know them and for them to get to know you, so we can sort of bypass all the maybe the relationships that younger people engage in or when we're younger because we don't really know what we want yet.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah, I think that's a helpful
Beautiful.
perspective too. It's just to the a point that you have made often. It's not always black and white. You know,
Yes.
there's a lot of gray. There's a lot of messiness, and I also feel like just open conversation and communication is key to really getting on
Very
the
key.
same page. Because yeah, you made a really good point about situationships being like you're just not having those conversations.
No, why
And
would you?
yeah,
Why would you? It's like I'm getting what I said I needed, so there's no point. Maybe you felt similarly, or people I know that that's sort of what you're looking for. When you want something real, when we want something real as men, we will move with intention. We will take our time. We will be patient. We will be understanding because we take that person seriously and we want to take that to the next level or maybe to the highest level that it can be. So I'm not going to avoid those type of conversations. Now they may be difficult in the fairness to men, because that's a huge part of why I'm here and why we're talking about this. It is very hard for us because many of us don't grow up in environments where it's comfortable to engage in these type of conversations. We don't even get the opportunity to get that experience with our own family a lot of times, where dad sits you down and talks to you about it, when mom sits you down and shares a lot about her lived experience. We don't get that. And so it is fundamentally harder for us, not because we're less emotional per se. We're just not allowed to be emotional.
mhm.
And it's really not fair. That's why I challenge that notion all the time. Because to do the work that I do, it would seem counterintuitive because I didn't get taught to do any of this stuff. I had to learn all this as I got older and really reprogram a lot of what I learned as a child because it was not constructive. It was not helpful. And there's no way in hell I'd be here if I still was operating from that mentality. So we can all change and we can all evolve, in that way. But I think it's imperative for us to be willing to make those adjustments, depending on what we want for our future. So I think this has been a hell of a discussion. And man, I can say I've learned a lot. So I genuinely appreciate you for everything that you put out here, every bit of yourself that you were willing to be vulnerable about, because this is the way that we learn. This is the way that we grow. If we don't engage in these type of conversations, no matter how uncomfortable at times they may be, then we should never expect anything to be different.
Mhm.
Because it means when things get uncomfortable, we're gonna run.
Yep.
When things get difficult, we're going to avoid. And as a man and as a therapist, like I'm unwilling for us to continue with that sort of mentality because it's not helpful and it's not productive. I want people to come together and then more importantly, when we're together, to stay together more often than not. So thank you for just making all the time that you did today. And I hope that maybe when you get the boutique business and you already got your content and stuff going, whatever other things you have going on, that you come back, maybe we can talk about it, maybe we can promote it, encourage it, whatever, support each other. I think it's important.
Yeah, of course. Thanks again for having me. I really enjoyed it. This was great. The one before, so much fun. And I'll definitely be a listener. I already became a listener just from you reaching out to me, but I'm looking forward to listening to your other shows with other guests. And I think what you're doing is really great.
Thank you. Thank you. I need all the encouragement because sometimes it is it's still a little challenging at times because this is still relatively new to me, but I feel more impassioned. Like the more that I have these conversations with people like you, the more passionate I feel because I'm like, man, I feel like the connection. I
Yeah.
feel the understanding. And I'm like, man, I truly hope for anybody who may be watching or listening, I hope you get some value from being able to get both a male and a female perspective on some of these topics that we're discussing because we obviously hit a lot of stuff today. And if anybody got any value, please like and subscribe because I'm trying to make more of this type of content as much as possible. But until next time, we're gonna sign off. So peace out.
Bye.